The tarmac was frozen, silent under the weight of a war already slipping out of control. In the dim light before dawn, a lone pilot walked toward a machine that carried more than fuel and ammunition it carried, Germany's last hope in the skies. He did not know it yet, but within the next 60 minutes, the outcome of an entire air war would become painfully clear. Behind him lay years of engineering, desperation, and belief in technological superiority. Ahead of him stood the FW190D, 9, sleek, powerful, and designed to reclaim the skies from an enemy that had become untouchable. Somewhere above those clouds, the P-51 Mustang ruled fast, relentless, and always present. This was not just a test flight. It was a question. Could Germany's finest piston-engine fighter finally challenge the aircraft that had turned the tide of the war in the air? Or had the answer already been decided far from the battlefield, in factories thousands of miles away? As the engine roared to life and the aircraft began to move, one truth was about to emerge. Not through theory, but through cold, unforgiving reality. By late 1944, the war in the skies over Europe had entered a phase of brutal clarity. The outcome was no longer shaped by isolated victories or individual heroics. It was being decided through sustained pressure day after day by fleets of American bombers crossing into German airspace. But the bombers themselves were not the true threat. It was what flew beside them. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang had transformed the nature of the air war. For the first time, American bombers were no longer vulnerable deep inside enemy territory. With its extended range, enhanced by drop tanks, the Mustang could escort formations all the way to Berlin and back. This single capability shattered the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy. German fighters could no longer wait for isolated targets. They were forced to confront an enemy that was faster, higher, and always protected. At altitude, where the air was thin and the margin for error was narrow, the imbalance became undeniable. The backbone of Germany's fighter force, the FW190A, had once been a formidable aircraft. Its radial engine provided durability and strong low-altitude performance. Pilots trusted it. They relied on it. But above 20,000 feet, it began to lose its strength. Engine performance dropped, climb rates suffered. And against an opponent optimized for high-altitude combat, these limitations became fatal. German pilots found themselves in a position no air force could afford, fighting an enemy they could not effectively reach. The numbers reflected this reality with unforgiving precision. In October 1944, American bomber losses were measured in dozens. German fighter losses were counted in the hundreds. This was not a failure of courage or experience. Many Luftwaffe pilots were veterans of years of combat. They had survived engagements that would have broken less seasoned airmen, but skill could not compensate for physics. It could not compensate for altitude performance, engine efficiency, or energy retention. And it certainly could not compensate for production. In response, Germany turned to what it did best, engineering a solution. The FW190D, known as the Dora, was conceived as an answer to this crisis. Its design represented a fundamental shift. The radial engine was replaced with a liquid-cooled Jumo 213, optimized for high-altitude performance. The fuselage was extended, aerodynamics refined. Every adjustment pointed toward one goal: to meet the Mustang on equal terms. On paper, the results were promising. Speed approached that of the P-51. Service ceiling allowed engagement at bomber altitude. Firepower remained devastating. It looked like the answer Germany had been searching for. But war is not fought on paper. By the time the Dora reached operational units in late 1944, the situation had already deteriorated. Factories had been bombed, resources were scarce, production was limited, and perhaps most critically, time had run out. Into this reality stepped Hans Lurcher. At just 30 years old, he was not only a pilot, but an analyst of war in its most technical form. He had flown dozens of aircraft, including captured Allied fighters. He understood their strengths not as rumors, but as measurable facts. Earlier that year, he had tested a captured P-51. What he found then had already raised concerns. Now, he was tasked with something far more important, not to speculate, but to measure, compare, and decide. With only 60 minutes of fuel, one aircraft, and a sky filled with unanswered questions, he would attempt to determine whether Germany still had a chance to reclaim control of its own airspace, or whether that control had already been lost. The engine roared to life with a deep, controlled vibration, smoother than the radial engines Lurcher had known for years. As the FW190D-9 began its takeoff roll, the aircraft surged forward with confidence. Within seconds, it lifted cleanly into the cold morning air. At low altitude, the Dora felt alive. Climbing through the first layers of sky, Lurcher noted the responsiveness of the controls. The aircraft handled with precision. At 10,000 feet, the speed stabilized above 400 miles per hour faster than the known performance of the P-51 at the same altitude. For a brief moment, the numbers suggested something encouraging. Here, at least, the Dora held an advantage. But the war was not fought here. The true battlefield lay higher. As he pushed the aircraft upward toward 20,000 feet, the tone of the test began to shift. The climb was steady, but not exceptional. Time stretched. Minutes passed. When he finally reached the target altitude, the realization was immediate and impossible to ignore. The Mustang would have been there much sooner. Even accounting for differences in test conditions, the gap was too large to dismiss. In combat, altitude was initiative. The aircraft that arrived first controlled the engagement, and in this metric, the Dora was already behind. At 25,000 feet, the air thinned and resistance faded. This was the critical test. Lurcher advanced the throttle, watching the airspeed indicator climb slowly, almost reluctantly. Without assistance, the aircraft struggled to reach its projected limits. Only after engaging the MW50 boost system did the engine respond with the power promised on paper. The speed increased. Briefly, the Dora approached parity, but it came at a cost. The boost could only be sustained for minutes. Once depleted, the aircraft would return to its baseline performance that could not match the Mustang's continuous output. The difference was subtle on paper. In combat, it was decisive. Still, raw speed was only part of the equation. The next test would reveal something deeper. From high altitude, Lurcher rolled the aircraft into a steep dive. Gravity pulled the Dora downward, accelerating rapidly past 500 miles per hour. Then, at the precise moment, he pulled back hard on the controls, converting speed into altitude in a maneuver known as a zoom climb. The aircraft fought upward, momentum carrying it higher and higher before finally surrendering to gravity. He noted the peak altitude carefully. Then he compared it to his earlier data from the Mustang. The difference was unmistakable. The P-51 retained more energy. It climbed higher from the same dive. It recovered faster. This was not just a performance gap. It was a tactical reality. In the kind of high-speed vertical combat that defined late-war air engagements, energy was survival. The aircraft that conserved it could attack again. The one that lost it became vulnerable. And the Dora was losing it. The final phase of the test simulated combat conditions. A dive from altitude, a firing pass, then an immediate climb back to safety. It was a standard interception profile. The Dora executed the maneuver cleanly but slowly. By the time it regained its starting altitude, more than 4 minutes had passed. The Mustang, based on all available data, would have done it significantly faster. That difference just over a minute was not abstract. It was the difference between controlling the fight and becoming the target. By the end of the sequence, one conclusion had begun to take shape in Lurcher's mind. Not dramatic, not emotional, just precise. The Dora could fight, but it could not decide the fight. By the time Lurcher reduced throttle and turned the Dora back toward base, the conclusion was no longer forming. It was already there, clear, measured, unavoidable. The aircraft had performed exactly as designed. There were no hidden flaws, no catastrophic failures, no unexpected weaknesses. In many ways, the FW190D-9 was the finest piston-engine fighter Germany had produced. It was fast, stable, and heavily armed. It responded precisely to control inputs. It carried the mark of engineering excellence. And yet, it was not enough. As he descended through the cold morning air, Lurcher began to reconstruct the reality of combat not as theory, but as consequence. Every scenario led to the same outcome. If the Dora attacked from above, it could initiate the engagement, but it could not sustain control. The Mustang, with superior energy retention, would recover faster, reposition, and return with advantage. If the Dora engaged at equal altitude, it entered a contest it could not dictate. The Mustang could accelerate away, disengage at will, or reverse direction faster than the German pilot could respond. If the Dora climbed from below, it exposed itself. Slow, visible, predictable, an easy target for an opponent already positioned higher in the sky. There was no winning position, only degrees of disadvantage. This was the tactical paradox Lurcher now faced. The FW-190D was not inferior in isolation, but war is not fought in isolation. It is fought in systems of speed, altitude, energy, and timing. And within that system, the Dora was always reacting, never deciding. Back on the ground, the stillness of the airfield felt different. The test was over, but its implications were only beginning to unfold. Lurcher left the aircraft without ceremony and walked directly to the technical office. There was no need for delay. The report took hours, page after page of measurements, comparisons, and conclusions. No speculation, no exaggeration, just data, structured into a reality that could not be ignored. He outlined the differences with precision. At combat altitude, the Mustang maintained a speed advantage, small but constant. In climb performance, it reached engagement altitude significantly faster. In energy retention, it outperformed the Dora by a margin that could not be recovered through pilot input. And then he addressed the deeper issue, not performance alone, but control. The P-51 pilot could choose when to engage, when to withdraw, and how to shape the fight. The FW-190D pilot could not. Every engagement became reactive. Every decision was constrained. This asymmetry, Lurcher wrote, was decisive. He continued further, moving beyond the aircraft itself. German tactical doctrine, built on aggression and close engagement, assumed a level of parity that no longer existed. Against an opponent with superior speed, climb, and endurance, those tactics were no longer bold. They were fatal. When the report reached higher command, the reaction was immediate, but not in the way Lurcher might have hoped. The data was not disputed, but the conclusion was, to acknowledge it would mean accepting a reality far more dangerous than any enemy aircraft that Germany no longer held technological or strategic parity in the air war. That its newest fighter, its final refinement, could not reverse the tide. The report was classified, restricted, quietly set aside. Not because it was wrong, but because it was too accurate. An ocean away, the war looked very different. In the United States, the struggle in the skies over Europe was not defined by desperation, but by momentum. Factories operated without interruption. Supply lines stretched across continents. And most importantly, time was on their side. The P-51 Mustang was not just an aircraft. It was the result of a system working at full capacity. While German engineers fought to refine performance under constant pressure, limited resources, damaged infrastructure, and shrinking timelines, American industry moved in the opposite direction. Production expanded. Designs were tested, improved, and standardized. Problems were not just solved, they were eliminated at scale. By late 1944, this difference had become impossible to ignore. Each month, hundreds of Mustangs rolled off assembly lines in California and Texas, not prototypes, not experimental designs. Fully operational aircraft, delivered to units with trained pilots, spare parts, and fuel to sustain continuous operations. In Germany, the situation was far more fragile. Factories were targets. Transportation networks were disrupted. Even when an aircraft like the FW-190D proved effective, production could not keep pace. Numbers declined when they were needed most. Replacement pilots arrived with less experience. Fuel shortages, limited training, and operational flexibility. This was not just a technological gap, it was a systemic imbalance. From a strategic perspective, the implications were profound. Air superiority is not achieved by individual engagements, but by sustained presence. The ability to patrol, escort, intercept, and return again and again without interruption. The Mustang made this possible. It extended the reach of American bombers, ensuring that industrial targets deep within Germany were no longer safe. It forced the Luftwaffe into a reactive posture where every interception came at increasing cost. And it created a cycle that Germany could not break. Losses led to fewer aircraft. Fewer aircraft led to less resistance. Less resistance led to more effective bombing. And more effective bombing further reduced Germany's ability to produce. From the outside, it may have appeared as a contest of machines, one aircraft against another. But in reality, it was a contest of systems. One side could replace losses faster than they occurred. The other could not replace them at all. Lurcher had measured the difference in speed, climb, and energy. What he had truly uncovered was something much larger. A war that was no longer being decided in the air, but in the factories that fed it. When the engine finally fell silent and the aircraft rested once more on frozen ground, nothing outward had changed. The FW190D-9 remained a remarkable machine, refined, powerful, and engineered with precision. It represented the peak of German piston-engine design, the culmination of years of experience, innovation, and adaptation under pressure. But beneath that surface, something far more important had shifted. The illusion of parity was gone. What Hans Lurcher had uncovered in those 60 minutes was not a flaw in a single aircraft. It was a truth about the nature of modern warfare. Victory no longer belonged to the side with the better machine in isolation. It belonged to the side that could sustain performance, replace losses, and adapt faster than the enemy could respond. The P-51 Mustang was not unbeatable because it dominated every metric. It was decisive because it dominated enough of them consistently, reliably, and at scale. And that final element scale could not be matched. In the months that followed, the outcome Lurcher had quietly documented continued to unfold. German fighter units flew missions they could not win against an enemy that dictated every engagement. Losses mounted, opportunities disappeared, and the sky, once contested, became controlled, not through a single battle, but through accumulation. After the war, when the noise had faded and the urgency was gone, Lurcher would reflect on that moment with clarity. The problem, he noted, had never been a lack of skill or courage. German pilots had both in abundance. The problem was time, and the problem was resources. An aircraft introduced too late, a system stretched too thin, a response always one step behind a moving target. These were not failures of engineering. They were failures of circumstance, and they carried consequences that no individual pilot could overcome. Today, that 60-minute flight remains more than a technical evaluation. It stands as a quiet reminder of a larger lesson, one that extends beyond aviation, beyond World War II itself. In any conflict shaped by industry, logistics, and endurance, excellence alone is not enough. It must be supported, sustained, multiplied, because in the end, the outcome of that cold morning in November 1944 was never truly decided in the sky above Germany. It had already been decided long before, in the factories, the supply chains, and the systems that made one side capable of continuing while the other slowly ran out of time. The battle may have ended, but the lesson remains.